Welcome, everyone, to this presentation, Redistricting 101. Texas Impact is hosting the event, and we are so tickled that Bonnie Bruce and Genevieve Van Cleve have agreed to share their wisdom about redistricting with us. Together, they bring a lot of experience. I want to say one quick thing on behalf of Texas Impact before I turn it over to our engagement director, Scott Atnip, who's going to be moderating the event. And that is this: redistricting is maybe the very most partisan issue that ever comes down the pike. It is, by its very nature, it is specifically partisan. Texas Impact, like the faith community generally, and also many of the other nonprofits that you all participate in, is rigorously nonpartisan. So it is sometimes challenging for organizations like Texas Impact to figure out how to even engage the topic of redistricting, because it is so, it tends to polarize people so quickly. Genevieve and Bonnie are the two people who I could think of who will be most able to give you the most objective and comprehensive overview of the topic. Everyone on this conversation probably has partisan views of their own, and you may want to ask questions that veer into partisanship. Please just know throughout this presentation, Texas Impact is nonpartisan, and we hope that everyone in this event will do their best to keep it focused on mechanics and process, not on partisan outcomes that one group or the other may hope for. So with that, I'm going to turn over to Scott, and I'm going to mute myself. So Scott Atnip is Texas Impact's engagement director, and Scott, you have the floor.
All right, I appreciate it, B, and thank you all for joining today. When B says I'm going to be moderating today, I'm going to do some quick introductions and then really just turn it over to Genevieve and Bonnie, who will have the floor for most of the evening, and I'll rejoin for questions. But I do want to say thanks to both of our presenters, and thanks to all of you for being here this evening. We are really excited to have this conversation with two leading experts on redistricting. And y'all, I've been receiving questions from many of y'all, and I have enough humility to admit that I was not in this position a decade ago during the last round of redistricting. And so I am as excited as you all are for the opportunity to learn tonight. And my hope is that you'll ask some really great questions after two incredible presentations. Speaking of questions, we're going to save time at the end tonight for that. So please use the Q&A feature to ask questions of the panelists. We're not going to try to scroll back through the entire chat to find those. So use the Q&A feature if you have questions for the panelists. Texas Impact likes to describe the chat section as kind of water cooler talk where you can talk to other participants or ask questions of the Texas Impact staff. We'll be in there hanging out and trying to ask questions or answer questions. I will note that if you want to send something to everybody who's watching, you need to check that you're sending it to everybody and not just the host and panelists. So with that, I'd like to go ahead and just move us on in. We have two incredible presenters tonight. First with us tonight, we're going to have Bonnie Bruce, who served as the chief of staff for Representative Bert Solomons, who chaired the House Redistricting Committee a decade ago in 2010. Bonnie successfully administered the progress of all four redistricting maps, and we'll talk more about that, but it's a congressional map, State Board of Education map, Senate and House maps. She'll be followed by Genevieve Van Cleve, who is the Texas State Director for All on the Line, which is an advocacy arm of the National Democratic Redistricting Committee. She's president of Van Vela Industries, if I said that right, a political consulting firm. She'll correct me momentarily if not. So I'd like to say, just again, we do have a ton of interest in this tonight. I want to thank you both for being with us. Just so everybody has an understanding of the agenda, we've given both Bonnie and Genevieve 30 minutes each. We'll follow those presentations with your questions. And we're going to start with Bonnie, who's going to help us understand what we can expect inside the building during this special session, and then turn it over to Genevieve for the outside game, what you can do part. So enough of me. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Bonnie. Bonnie, thanks.
Thank you so much, Scott, and I appreciate being here. I really appreciate the invitation. This is my second presentation on redistricting to this group. I have already done a Redistricting 101, which happened before the U.S. Census numbers came out. And so this time I'm going to try to focus on what those numbers meant and what is happening at the Capitol with those numbers. As Scott said, I was the redistricting clerk in the 2011 cycle. I am not in any way involved in redistricting this session. I'm not working inside the building. And so this is only what I can see and my experience that I have from being in their seats 10 years ago. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen at this point, and we'll get started. So we're going to start with some terms and overlaying concepts. First, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Sometimes you'll hear it referred to as the VRA. A lot of people say that this has been repealed because of Shelby v. Holder. That is inaccurate. What the Voting Rights Act does, it protects minority, majority districts, civil voting rights legislation, which protects your right to vote. And the act itself was not impacted by the U.S. Supreme Court decision Shelby v. Holder. What was impacted was the algorithm that the Congress used to apply those certain protections, including preclearance, to certain states or districts. And the court said this algorithm is outdated, and until you can come up with a different algorithm, then the current states and districts are not going to be under preclearance. Congress has yet to adopt a new algorithm. The Voting Rights Act is still there. So moving on to preclearance. What is preclearance? Preclearance would mean that a state or a district, a county, a city, who is under preclearance would be required, after they adopt any legislation on elections, any changes to districts that impact voting rights, that legislation, those maps would have to be approved by the Department of Justice, the Federal Department of Justice, prior to them being enacted. Texas used to be under preclearance. They no longer are because of Shelby v. Holder, which means that whatever maps the Texas legislature adopts can immediately go into effect. It also means that if somebody sues the state of Texas over those maps, that the plaintiffs will have the burden of proof. When there is preclearance, the state has the burden of proof to show that there was not discrimination. This time around, if sued, the plaintiffs will have a burden to show that there was discrimination. Now, there is, another provision in the Voting Rights Act which says that you can claw back a state or a district into preclearance without the Congress adopting a new algorithm if you can show a consistent pattern of discrimination. And so I think that is one thing that there are parties out there considering right now, between the election legislation, which was adopted recently in special session, and some of the expected maps that we're going to see out of this special session. I think there are parties that are not only going to sue over those pieces of legislation, but are going to use that as a pattern of discrimination to try and claw Texas back into preclearance under a provision of the Voting Rights Act. So racial versus partisan gerrymandering. The Supreme Court of the United States has said that partisan gerrymandering, which means drawing a district with, that's not compact, just to come out with a particular racial or partisan outcome. Partisan gerrymandering is not a justicable issue, meaning it's not something the Supreme Court wants to see anymore in their court. And so basically they have given free rein to all state legislatures and redistricting commissions to be able to draw maps based on partisan outcomes. Racial gerrymandering is not allowed. That is an issue under the Voting Rights Act that somebody can still be sued for, the state or district. One of the things I want to enforce to people is not to make the mistake to assume that a particular race is going to vote for a particular party, that any minority is going to be a Republican or a Democrat. You can draw maps to make a solid Democrat district. That district may happen to be a minority majority district. That's where it gets confusing in a courtroom, is whether you drew that district because you were racially gerrymandering or whether you were drawing a district for partisan outcomes. Cracking and packing, I know Genevieve says she's going to go over this in her presentation a little bit later, so I'm just going to touch on it. Cracking and packing has to do with minority majority districts and minority populations, and whether or not you're taking that group, that minority group, and you're either dividing it up, you're cracking it, and putting it into multiple different districts in an effort to prevent that group from having its own district and its own ability to elect its candidate of choice. Or conversely, packing is where you have a minority majority district and you just continue to pile on, and you take all the minorities that are surrounding it and continue to put it into that district where that might deny them from having influence on a district surrounding them, from having an opportunity to influence that election for a candidate of their choice. County line rule. This is a provision of the Texas Constitution. It only applies in Texas, doesn't apply in other states. The Texas Constitution says that for Texas House districts only, so this doesn't apply to U.S. congressional districts. It doesn't apply to Texas Senate districts. It doesn't apply to the State Board of Education districts, only for Texas House districts. If you can draw a district inside the county line and be within the deviation of the ideal population, which we will talk about in a second, then it must. And the purpose of that is so that counties have dedicated representation in the Texas House of Representatives. If you have enough population inside that county where all of the districts will fit within that county and still be within the deviation, then it becomes a drop-in district, meaning all of the districts are inside the county line and nobody can steal the population from that county to make up population in other districts. And I'll show you how that works in just a minute. And the last is pairing. Pairing is where if you have a district, Bonnie Bruce, House District 1, if I am under the number of people that I need, I'm going to need to expand the boundaries of my district in order to get more geography and therefore more people in my district. But if I live right next door to Genevieve in House District 2, and she needs population as well, and both of our boundaries expand to where we encompass both of our homes, then suddenly the two of us are sitting in a single district. And that happens, that's called pairing of two incumbents. So you can have two people then put into one district and they're called paired. So I might use some of these terms a little bit later on, so I wanted to give you a little preview of what they are. All right, so moving on. Recent timelines. August 12th, U.S. Census Bureau releases the redistricting level data to all 50 states. It is available publicly. You can just Google U.S. Bureau data release and it'll come up with its press release. It has all the links to its data. It's huge. It is broken down by state. If you're really geeky, you can pull it all up if you want to. On September 1, Senator Roland Gutierrez, a Democrat in Texas out of San Antonio, and Senator Sarah Eckhart, a Democrat out of Austin, and the Tejano Democrats file a suit against the Texas legislature for adopting maps. The reason why is the Texas Constitution says that the legislature shall draw maps, redistrict district boundaries at the first regular session after the census data has been released. We've never been in a situation before where the data was released after the members were adjourned in their regular session. So here we are. We're now 4 months after the regular session, and we now have data. And so what Senators Gutierrez, Eckhart, and the Tejano Democrats are saying is that we need to wait until 2023 in order to draw maps, in order for the legislature to draw maps. Some of you may be saying, well, what happens to those 2 additional congressional districts that Texas got? What they're asking is for the courts to draw those maps and for that court-drawn map to be used in the election that's going to happen next year. However, that suit hasn't done anything yet. There hasn't been a hearing or anything, certainly not an injunction issued. So Governor Abbott on September 7th went ahead and announced that he was going to have a 3rd special session, which started yesterday. And among many issues was to be on that call was redistricting. And so yesterday the members came back and were started their 3rd special session, and already the Senate redistricting chair has released a bill for a map for the Senate districts and for the State Board of Education districts. And she has set hearings to begin on those maps on this Friday and Saturday. So what did the census say? Texas gained almost 4 million people. That is the 2nd largest state in terms of population. We are 2nd to California. In redistricting, growth of population is relative. So for example, California grew by 6%. They gained population, but they lost a congressional seat. That's because 6 states grew at a rate of about 10% or more. Those states are Texas, Florida, North Carolina, Colorado, Oregon, and Montana. They all gained congressional seats. Texas actually gained 2 seats, where all the rest of those gained 1. California actually lost a congressional seat. That's because growth is relative in redistricting. Just because you grew didn't mean you gained enough population to compare to other areas of the nation or inside Texas, inside the state of Texas, comparing districts to districts. After the census, California has 52 congressional seats, Texas has 38, Florida has 28, and New York has 26, and Illinois and Pennsylvania are tied in 5th place with 17 seats each. So we have a question. Does the lawsuit filed on 9/1 to stop the redistricting during a special session have true merit? Is it likely to stop the current process? I will admit I am not an attorney. So I haven't seen anything. I've read the pleading. I know it's based off of the Texas Constitution language, which is just on its plain face says the next regular session. And there won't be another regular session until 2023. Whether or not the court feels like that is a good argument, we're in uncharted territory. I think Roland Gutierrez gave a interview yesterday where he said, this is brand new territory. It's never happened before. And so the legal arguments are going to set precedent one way or another. So of these 4 million people, who are they and where do they live? Okay, so this slide is a Texas Legislative Council slide. For those who don't know, this is a nonpartisan organization which is a support organization for the Texas legislature. In this, if a county is more green, then that's a higher percentage of growth. The more purple, it is a higher loss. So these are percentages of change inside that county. If you'll note the loss of West Texas, most of West Texas is purple over here. Also in East Texas, there's huge losses here and here. Also in the valley, in the middle of the valley. Where we see large population gains are in urban and suburban areas. So we have the Permian Basin oil field here. This is Midland, Odessa, and surrounding counties. And then you have some gain in El Paso here. Taylor County, this is where Abilene is. Amarillo is in Potter County, which lost population just slightly, but its suburb in Randall County, they actually gained. Where you see the main population is right here in what I'm going to call the Golden Triangle. It's Dallas-Fort Worth, down the I-35 corridor, down to San Antonio, over to Houston and its suburbs and back up. 80% of Texas population is east of this I-35 corridor, 80%. 90% of Texas population is in an urban area. So this is the Texas, all of the slides that have this little Texas with a star in it. This is from the Texas Demography Center at UT San Antonio. They do some great work. This is a vision of Texas with a numeric change. Where do the actual numbers change? In this map, green is actually a loss, and the brown is gain. And as you can see, you have the same golden triangle right here, right? You can also see some gains in Lubbock, Midland, Odessa, El Paso, and down here in Hidalgo County. You can see 143 counties in Texas lost population. What you're seeing is this move from the rural areas into our urban and suburban areas. So who are the people? So this is, hello. In 2010, the breakdown of racial makeup of Texas, 45% of Texas was white, 37% was Hispanic, 11% was Black, 3.8% Asian, and 1.8% other. In 2020, you're looking at an almost even number of Hispanics, 39.3%, and whites, 39.7%. Black population has maintained its ratio, whereas Asians have increased slightly, and others has also increased. This other is a surprising increase. A lot of it is 2 or more races, people who are claiming that they're not a single minority, but 2 or more. So this is a big, huge chart, and I'm not expecting you to take it all in, but what I want to show you is this very last line. Percent contribution to total change over the last decade. White population was 4.7% of that change, of that 4 million increase in people. It was just due to 4% white. 49.5% of that increase is Hispanic. All minorities were worth 95.2% of that increase in population. So a lot of people might look at this and say that, well, obviously the new seats need to be Hispanic, or they need to be a minority district. And it's not always that easy. And the reason why is because you need to have a district that's a majority of the population, it's compact, that minority is cohesive. In other words, they vote together. They want the same person. They want to elect the same person. And so when you start talking about a large district, it gets harder and harder to get a majority of that. The designation NH, non-Hispanic, is used nationwide. That is a Census Bureau designation. It is not just in Texas. So those Hispanic used to actually be considered white under the U.S. Census Bureau. And at some point, I think in the early 80s, they split it out as its own racial designation, which is why white is non-Hispanic white. I'm not sure what their reasoning was for splitting out the designation, but that's why that's there. So this is the state of Texas again, with white population. Green is loss. you can see white people are flooding out of the rural areas into our urban and our suburban areas. This is true in our major, our major areas, not so much in Dallas and Tarrant, but our suburban districts in the Metroplex. And then all the way up and down I-35 corridor, we have white gains in population. And then again in the suburban areas outside of Harris County. Hispanic population, 63 counties lost Hispanic population, but look where our gains are again, right down the I-35 corridor and in our Golden Triangle. A little bit in El Paso and down here in Hidalgo. But again, you see our population moving into this Golden Triangle. Black population, coloring is a little different for this one. I'm not sure why, but again, what you're seeing is this Golden Triangle is where our population increases are for every single race. So it's the white population, the Hispanic population, the Black population, they're all moving into our urban areas. This makes it difficult to draw a minority-majority district simply because of integration. Everybody's moving into the same area. Everybody's moving into the same cities. And the larger the district, it makes it harder to draw that majority. Why are Native Americans given their own category? Are they included in non-Hispanic other category? So when you actually look at a Census Bureau, it actually breaks down into a lot of different categories. They can do, they do Pacific Asian, they do Native Americans. I think Middle Eastern is included in Asian population. Asian population is actually pretty broad. But as far as the data that Texas uses, they have fewer numbers simply because at a certain point, there's not enough Pacific Islanders to draw a minority-majority district, and so it doesn't quite matter that you break that racial category out. So moving on, I keep talking about making a district and the population needed to make a district. So let's talk about what those numbers are. The ideal size of Texas Senate, House, U.S. Congressional, and State Board of Education districts. These are the four maps that the Texas legislature is going to have to draw. You can see here from smallest to largest, our House districts to our State Board of Education districts. And yes, congressional districts are actually smaller than our state Senate districts and our State Board of Education districts. Congressional districts gained in population and in number. Everybody else, our congressional districts went from 36 seats to 38 seats. Everybody else stays the same based on the Constitution. The Constitution says, the Texas Constitution says, there are 150 House seats, 31 state Senate seats, and 15 State Board of Education seats. You can see the population increase in the last decade. This is all of the numbers for 2010, and these are the current numbers. A House district is going to have 194,303 people in it. A congressional district is going to have 766,987 people in it. A Texas Senate district is almost going to have 1 million people, 1 million people, one persons. And then the State Board of Education is going to have 1.9 million people in it. So you can see these are some extremely large districts, especially when you start thinking about comparing a state Senate seat in, say, New Hampshire. So the ideal populations, what these numbers are is the total state population divided by these number of seats. So the 29 million people divided by 150, the state population divided by 38 congressional seats. And that's how you get these ideal populations. Well, why is that ideal population important? So these are our districts and their ideal population. The courts require for congressional districts, that there be as little deviation from the ideal population as practicable. What does that mean? It means that every single district in the maps that we drew in 2011, every single congressional seat had the exact same number of people except for one district, which had one more person in it. That is how exact the congressional maps have to be. The House maps, the state maps, state Senate maps, and the State Board of Education, the courts allow a deviation of, whoa, I am so sorry. Sorry about that. The courts allow a deviation of 10% from the ideal. Now, that is not 10% up. It's not 10% below. It is 10% on either side of the ideal population, but it's not even 5 and 5. What it is 10% deviation from the smallest district in the entire state to the largest district in the entire state. This is where we start seeing people play politics. The ideal population manipulation, it's possible to use this to save Republican rural seats. We saw all of that rural area, which was losing population. That's bad for Republicans because it's those rural areas which are solid Republican. The urban areas are becoming more and more Democratic, and the suburban areas are becoming very mixed, Republican, Democrat. There are areas of the state like Denton and Collin County, which used to be the home of the Tea Party in Texas, which is now is not solidly Republican anymore. It's pretty much considered purple. And so in order to save some of these rural Republican seats so they don't have to be paired, so that you can have as many of them in the rural areas as possible, a strategy that you can use is to set your deviation inside rural areas as low as possible. Say you are 8% under the ideal population, so you underpopulate these districts, which means the largest district in the entire state in your urban areas can only be 2% over the ideal. Where that gets tricky is in the urban areas, there's not as much Republican population. And if you don't, if you're going to end up with a very, very, very narrow margin for them to be able to hold on to those urban Republican seats. So this is what I think that the Republicans in both the House and the Senate, the leadership is looking at to be able to try and save their majority, their colleagues, and their power, which let's be honest, all redistricting is about power, political power, electoral power, the power of the people to choose who they want to vote for them. But it's also the power of the people who are already in office. It's also the elected officials' survival. People who get paired, only one of them's coming out. You have the highest number of freshmen in the Texas legislature after every redistricting cycle. So let's go on. This is the current Texas House districts colorized based on their deviation from the ideal population. All of the districts that you see that are gray are districts which are within that plus or minus 5% deviation. They don't really need to grow or shrink very much. The greener you get, the more population you need. The browner you get, the less population you need. And so as you can see right away, you have the people who are on the border areas, they have lost population. That means their districts are going to have to expand. They're going to have to come into this area. They're going to have to come into the suburban and urban areas here and in here in order to pick up population, in order to have enough population in those districts to maintain their seats. Same in the Senate. The greener you get, the more population you have to give. In the yellow versions, this is where they have lost. And again, this is bad for Republicans because those are the areas that are solid Republicans. I'm at my 30 minutes. I'll try as much as I can to wrap up quickly. This is a partisan makeup of precincts. So you can actually see this Democrat leaning in our suburban areas, and all of this red is where we're losing population in Texas. A redistricting bill is a bill just like any other bill. It needs to pass the House. It needs to pass the Senate. Genevieve is going to talk to you about how you can have your voice heard in these hearings, but it still needs to pass each chamber and be signed by the governor before it becomes law. Right now, we are in special session. It's only 30 days. For the members, there's pressure to get it done in the 30 days, because if there is a fourth special session, if they don't get these maps done this session, then if a fourth special is called immediately after, it would run from October 20th to November 18th. Why does that scare them? Because they've already passed this bill, Senate Bill 13, from the second special, which says if we don't pass a map by certain dates, we will push off the primary. If they don't pass a map by November 15th, they push the primary from March 1 to April 5th. Longer electoral times are bad for incumbents. If you have a short election, then they have the jump on money, they have the jump on name ID. But the longer you have that primary out there, the more opportunities there are for challengers to raise money, for them to put things out there that damage the incumbents. So they're under a time pressure here. There's only 2 maps that have been filed so far: Senate Bill 4 by Senator Joan Huffman and Senate Bill 7 by Senator Joan Huffman, who's the chair of redistricting the Senate for the State Board of Education. Now, these maps have 2 numbers, and I want you to understand this. It's really important. Senate Bill 4 is the state Senate districts. This bill has 2 numbers, Senate Bill 4 and S2101. The reason why is that it will keep the bill number, Senate Bill 4, throughout the entire process. But just like any other bill, it can be amended in committee or it can be amended on the floor. That S2101 is the designation for the map for the Texas Legislative Council. So once that map changes, they will draw a new map and they will give it a new number. And so just so you know that you are speaking to the right map before you in testimony, you want to make sure that you have not only the bill number correct, but you have the map correct, the map number correct. This is the proposed Senate map. And you're going to be able to see here, I'm going to pull it up. Here's the current districts on the left and the proposed districts on the right. And you can start to see what I'm talking about. The people who are on the outside, they have to come in to be able to pick up more population. They come in and pick up areas that they've never had before. Lieutenant Governor has clearly taken Senator Dawn Buckingham's seat, Senate District 24. Senator Dawn Buckingham has already declared that she is not going to run again. And so that relieves some pressure on the map because they're able to cannibalize some of those districts, right? And so what he's done is he's allowed Senator Perry to come in and take some of her counties. He's allowed Birdwell to come in and take some of her counties over the top. He has created this district that wraps around and picks up the home of Pete Flores, who is a Republican who ran and won Senate District 19, a traditionally Democrat district, in a special election. And he's created a district basically for him here out of Dawn Buckingham's old district. But in order to do that, he's had to push up Donna Campbell. You can see up here, Angela Paxton, who used to be completely inside Collin County, has been pushed out into rural areas And this is Senator Hughes, who's had to come wrap around. They've cannibalized some of Bob Hall's district, number 2, in order to get a more Republican area for Paxton. Remember, I told you that, Collin and Denton aren't as reliable for Republicans anymore. And so they've pushed her out here, and they've stolen out of Bob Hall. And they've pushed Bob Hall into areas that are brand new to him. The main things you're probably going to hear about, though, is Senate District 10, this district right here. It is not a minority majority district. It is a 50-50 Senate seat, is the only 50-50 Senate seat. And Beverly Powell, this is the current district right here. You can see it's completely contained inside Tarrant County. A Democrat, Beverly Powell, holds it now. What they've done to her district, if they've pushed it out into the suburban, more rural areas, which is more Republican. And so they've changed this from a 50-50 seat into a majority Republican seat. And so you can see, I hope, the way that map drawers are likely to start looking at drawing maps to preserve Republican majorities, to preserve opportunities for a greater number of Republicans. And so it's all based on that population loss and that Republican versus Democrat areas in the state. And so I'm going to leave it there because I've already run over my time, unless anybody has any questions.
Well, thank you, Bonnie, for that. And I've been looking at the questions coming in and know that you have been taking many of them throughout the presentation. So thank you. That was very helpful. And I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Genevieve. You are there. Excellent. And we'll hear about how we can participate in this process now.
Okay. Well, thank you, Bonnie. Thank you, Scott. Thank you, Bea. I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen. We've got a lot to cover. I think it's important to note that Republicans don't actually have to come in to major urban centers. They could actually pair themselves and not crack and pack people of color so that they have no representation except for from white men that live in rural areas, which is what this Senate map does, particularly in SD 10. So I'm going to share my screen, and we're going to go over what we can do about this mess. Can y'all see that? I think you can. I'm going to do you guys are getting a presentation that I did to my Ride or Die Club. Because yes, there's going to be hearings on Friday or Saturday in the Senate, but of course you will have to show up in person to the Petri dish that is the Capitol if you would like to participate. And you need to show up early because you need to get a COVID test and a wristband to go in the Senate chamber where the hearing is. You can still submit testimony, and we'll get to that in a minute. So basically, now that these maps are dropped, no one except for people that have the privilege to hop in a car and drive on down to the Capitol during work hours on Friday or on Saturday will be able to weigh in on exactly what the Senate has done. So I'm going to go into presenter mode, which means I really won't be able to see the chat or questions, but we'll get to questions when we get to them. All right, Ride or Die Club. So real quick, we're going to go over a legislative timeline, Senate hearing preparation. We've got a call-out tool to hold these people accountable, and some social media suggestions. So what I just said, you can submit written testimony. And I'll drop that link in the chat when we're answering questions later. Or you can find it, if you're familiar with the Texas Legislative Online website, which was awesome in 1998, but is a little hard to deal with in 2021. All the information I'm giving you about these hearings are in the hearing announcements in the Redistricting Committee. And feel free to share this link to everyone you know. Because if you can't make the trip, at least you can let them know what you think about these maps. If you're interested in in-person testimony, Friday at 10 a.m., Saturday at 9 a.m. You will have to get COVID testing, and wristbands are required for access to the table hearing room. Free COVID testing and wristbands are available in E1 something. Can't see my own slide. E1 0101. I would recommend bringing money for parking and food. Bring a light sweater because that building is cold. Bring a phone charger and bring testimony that's no more than 3 minutes. And I'm going to make sure that B and Scott, I have a little worksheet on how to build testimony, and I'll go through a little bit of that here in a minute. So what we know, here it is, right? Like, here's the basic plan. I suspect that these maps will be done and dusted, and they will not do another special session for the reasons that Bonnie laid out, but particularly because anytime you move a primary to say April or May, there's generally a lower turnout. So for example, I don't know if y'all remember when Ted Cruz first got elected, but that was actually a moved primary after redistricting 10 years ago. So that's how we got Ted Cruz. I wanted to go over what cracking and packing actually is. There's a lot of buzzwords in redistricting, frankly, and I don't want you to worry about buzzwords. I want you to understand them so that you know what you're looking at. On the left side, my left side, you see what I like to call the Iowa example, right? There's an evenly distributed number of red and blue squares. They draw some squares in the middle there. 2 reds, 2 blues, everything is copacetic. People that are running for office in this scenario have to actually engage with all constituents instead of just primary voters. And they have to have better ideas than the ones that are, say, in the legislature right now. Packing, boy, howdy, packing and cracking. This is the bread and butter of people that draw gerrymandered maps. In packing, you want to shove every single member of like a party or a group of people like African Americans or Hispanics or Asian American people into one district. And what that does is it whitens and makes more conservative the districts around it. So, yeah. So, I mean, it's done all over the Senate map. And it's been that way in urban areas for a very long time. Cracking, Travis County is a beautiful example. We have 6 members of Congress that touch Travis County. 3 of those members of Congress did not certify the 2020 election. What do you know about voters in Travis County? They overwhelmingly have a certain set of values, a community of interest, a very diverse population, and yet are represented by absolutely no one of color and only 1 Democrat. It's problematic. So cracking is when you break people apart so that they don't get to vote for people that share their values or their background. So if we're talking about what we can actually do, before I jump into this next part, to be entirely honest with you, the redistricting process is the last smoke-filled room in Texas politics, right? They generally will host a series of hearings with no map and no census data so that in future judicial settings, they can say they hosted hearings and let the public in. So they've had a series of hearings, some of which just ended. But for now that actual maps are coming out, your ability to talk about these maps, to add input to these maps, and to have that input listened to, and then the maps change to reflect people addressing their legislators, is next to nothing. The reason to testify is to build a strong public record so that regardless of what anyone votes for in the coming days and weeks, as these maps are evaluated, which they certainly will be by courts, your voice will be in the public record. So, what do you do about that, right? Well, you gotta create some testimony, and you get 3 minutes. So my suggestion is you need to write down what you want to say, practice what you want to say, time it, even practice with a friend. I can tell you that All on the Line has done 2 different, we've done, I don't know, I've trained probably 2,000-3,000 people at this point. But, you know, COVID and everything else has changed the way hearings worked and when they were. So it's been really hard to get people into this process. But I am happy to set up another workshop if a group of folks are interested in that, because my number one goal, my number one job is to make sure as many people as humanly possible are actually a part of this process. Because I'm sure Bonnie said this, but I'm going to say it again. This process, this redistricting process, is where all the power and the money is divvied up for a decade. Hence the not a lot of hearings, hard to get to the hearings, hard to sign up for the hearings. Why aren't there hearings when maps? Why aren't there regional hearings when there are maps? It's because there's a lot at stake. If there wasn't anything at stake, it'd be very easy to get a hearing, right? But that's not the world we live in. So this process, if it were to work well, it would mean that you, the people, were in the driver's seat of democracy, and that people would not be picking and choosing voters to hold on to power or to cut a group of people out of being represented. The whole point of the exercise is once the census comes back, then the exercise is supposed to be about changing maps to match where people live now, not where they lived 10 years ago, not where they're going to live in the future, and not even who they necessarily vote for, but to make these maps match where people live now. Keep in mind that 95% of the growth in the census was due to people of color. So if the maps do not reflect, do not have districts where there are people of color choosing their elected officials and being able to do that successfully, regardless of party, then you've got a bad map, right? And so the Senate map, for example, that has just been put out by Joan Huffman over the weekend, has not one competitive district. Further, Beverly Powell's district is being destroyed. It's being connected with 2 rural counties. That means that all the people of color in Beverly Powell's district that got together as a coalition and elected her will be not represented by a person of their own choosing. It'll be the people in Parker County and wherever else that are calling the shots for thousands upon thousands of the blessed community. So, the other thing you should know is that there has not been one map passed by the Texas legislature since the Voting Rights Act was passed in 1965 that hasn't been in violation of the Voting Rights Act, meaning that whether Democrats were in charge, whether Republicans were in charge, the result for people of color has been the same. Their votes and their voices have been diluted. The other thing you should know is that in a court case called Shelby County versus Holder, my boss, A.G. Holder at the time, it took the teeth out of what's called pre-clearance, meaning that a state like Texas with a long history of racial animus and proven a track record of racist map making, we before Shelby was gutted, we would have to get permission from the Department of Justice if we were going to pass a map, so that they could look at it and see that we hadn't sort of gone to where we usually go to as a group in the legislature. And that's the same. The same is true with voting rights as well, right? Like pre-clearance means that Texas can change what they want about elections, and there's no federal oversight any longer. Now, the John Lewis Voting Rights Act actually puts the teeth back in pre-clearance from the DOJ. So, what are we going to say at these hearings? Oh, the final thing I was going to tell you is the Shelby case also gutted the idea. No, sorry, the Shelby case didn't do this. The last Supreme Court announcement about redistricting was that partisan gerrymandering, although problematic, they would not be hearing any sort of claims about partisan gerrymandering. So to the victors go the spoils, according to the Supreme Court, I guess. But as we all know, right, the census happens and then we redraw districts so that people that live here now get to elect the leaders of their own choosing, as opposed to being chosen by a incumbent. So what are we going to say about these maps? It's going to be particularly helpful. I assume that you've had a chance to read these first three talking points. And I know this is a nonpartisan gathering, but there's only one party that is doing this and in power right now. So I'm going to move forward a little bit here. The other thing is that the Senate has had hearings, and so far, in my viewing of the map, it doesn't appear that they paid any attention to what the public said. Because I went to a lot of those hearings. In fact, I trained a lot of people that went to those hearings. And far and away, Republicans and Democrats all want gerrymandering to end, right? They want it to stop. They want their cities, their counties, they want their neighborhoods to stop being sort of shoved and stretched to serve incumbents as opposed to their own communities, sort of regardless of party. Yeah, that map publishes no competitive seats. And there's extreme cracking and packing in urban centers and surrounding areas, including Austin, DFW, Houston, San Antonio, including Collin, Denton, Harris, Fort Bend, and Bexar counties. So all of these rural folks that I guess need more population, what they're doing is in those ring counties where we've seen so much growth, particularly in communities of color, they're simply cracking and packing them to continue to hold on to power. And frankly, while Latino and Hispanic community members have made up nearly half of the growth overall in the past decade, the map fails to adequately reflect this growth in any way. So we have to say something. And I don't think it has to be partisan. But the answer is not that we continue on the path that we're on, because Texas, frankly, is a more urban, more diverse state than it's ever been. But if you look at the legislature, if you look at the Senate, the House, you know, what you don't see reflected back is millions of new Texans. And I would ask all of you, whether you're thinking about submitting written testimony, whether you're thinking about showing up on Friday or Saturday, if you have time, and talking about these maps to the committee, that they actually have more than one or two hearings, right? Because, you know, unless you're a lawyer, a lobbyist, or a legislator, you probably don't know there are hearings right now. You didn't know that they happened a couple of weeks ago. You didn't know they were scheduled in July, and you didn't know they were happening in the spring, because there's been absolutely no sustained public information about this process whatsoever. And in a thriving democracy, that is not how it's supposed to work, no matter who's in charge. So we have a call out tool, and I'm actually going to stop sharing here a little bit so I can drop the link in for you guys, because we're going to start asking people now to call their legislators and not to rubber stamp bad maps. And we're asking all of the legislature. We're not asking one party or the other. In fact, AG Holder is very specific about this. We are not in the business of putting our thumb on the scale for one party or the other. All we want is some semblance of fairness, right? Because if you have some semblance of fairness, then politicians get to duke out in the sort of marketplace of ideas the best solutions for Texas. I'm not sure anything that you have seen in the regular session or in these special sessions has sort of lived up to the goal of sort of fairness, right? Like, we have a huge winter storm, hundreds of people are dead, and there's basically no reform regarding our unregulated electricity grid, even though in poll after poll, more like a majority of Texans want to expand Medicaid. Hasn't happened. People care about climate change not being addressed. People care about gun violence not being addressed. But if you're really concerned about young kids that want to play sports and maybe started out in one gender but are fluid and moving to another, then if that apparently is the most important thing in the whole dang world. But I guarantee you most Texans are not sitting around the breakfast table worried about that. So everything that you care about is touched by redistricting. Every single issue. And the impact cannot be understated. For the next 10 years, who makes policy and what those policies are will be determined by these maps. And you've got maybe 2 days to talk about it to your legislators, maybe a day. Well, actually, the House is not, the chairman of the House Redistricting Committee hasn't agreed to have any hearings. So you may or may not get to talk about these maps once they're released. And we haven't even talked about the congressional maps. Let me just stop here for a minute and answer some questions. Does written testimony carry as much weight for the public record as oral testimony? I believe that it does. I'm happy to send any of our talking points to anyone after this call. What I will send to Be in the Gang are a worksheet on how to build testimony and the talking points that we just went over. And in fact, I'm going to pull up a different presentation and just walk you through how to create testimony, because it seems a little daunting, but it's really, it's easier than you think. So let me grab that for you quickly. I believe this is it. I have a lot of slide decks. I did 10 trainings in the last week and a half.
You're popular.
I would say more than I am popular. I think the truth of the matter is that people are very concerned that their voices and votes will count the same as their neighbors, right? Which is, again, what this process is about. It's not about incumbency. It's not about holding on to power. It's about ensuring that their vote counts the same as their neighbors. It's called one person, one vote. So I'm going to share my screen. All right. And do a little presenter stuff on how to testify. And in fact, I think I'm going to back up just a little bit here. Yeah. So the type of testimony that we recommend doing centers around your community of interest. And let's talk about what those are. So a community of interest is geographically defined and shares common interests or values. These values may be largely social or policy oriented outcomes. So let me give you an exhaustive list of types of communities of interest. So, for example, my community of interest, I would say, is I live 2 blocks away from I-30. My neighborhood is bookended by I-35 and Airport Boulevard and 38th and a half Street. We have one elementary school right down the street, Maplewood Elementary. That elementary school has been losing population because it has become very difficult for normal folks to own a home, rent a place to live in Austin. However, there's lots of Spanish and English speakers at that school, and overall, their needs in many ways are not being met at that school, not because the kids are bad, their families are bad, or their teachers are bad, but because, say, they live on this side of town as opposed to the other side of town. The resources are a little bit different because we pay for everything through property taxes in Texas. Therefore, if you live in a property poor area, then you have less money to put together a school. Whereas if you live in a property rich area, you have more money to put into schools. COVID issues. I never thought I would be talking about communities of interest in COVID. But for example, in the Eastern Crescent of Travis County, more African Americans and Latinos have died of COVID than, in fact, people have died in general in COVID, more in the Eastern Crescent of Travis County than, say, in the western part of Travis County. There also happen to be fewer doctors, community clinics, and hospitals in this part of the county. So some of those issues related to whether we refuse to expand Medicaid, whether we invest in, healthcare for all, et cetera, means that there's a whole bunch of people that have been impacted by COVID in a way that other parts of the community haven't. So that's a community of interest. Whether you live in an area with lots of homeowners or renters, these are ways to describe where you live. We talked a little bit about schools, but transportation, I would say that it's always good to sort of talk about where you live in reference to a busy street corner or some sort of physical feature that makes your area identifiable. Environmental concerns. For example, if you live in certain areas, there are water quality issues. There are air quality issues. Do you live next to a cement plant? Are rates of asthma high in your area? That would be another way to explain how something binds you, a public policy outcome binds you in the area in which you live. Are elections conducted fairly? Do you have to stand a long time in line? Do they have enough machines? Again, all of these different features could be something very important in your neighborhood. Who's the major employer in your area? Is it one company? Is it a county? Is it a city? In a lot of places, particularly in rural Texas, the big employer is the school district, right? So how those schools are funded matters because they've got a whole bunch of employees to pay for. Recreation. Does your area have a good park? Is it close to a river, or is it close to, a feature of some kind where people recreate? What are the celebrations in your area? Do you have a particularly good Juneteenth parade in your neighborhood? How do people access everyday resources? For example, does the trash get picked up on time? Does the brush get picked up on time? Does the power work? I know that's kind of a hard one these days, since the power most definitely did not work for several important days earlier this year. But how fast do you come back from a big storm? How fast do you come back from a hurricane or other sort of weather event? Notable organizations. Do you live close to a university? Do you live close to a church? Do you live close to a large employer? Again, all of this to say, these are different things that you can use to create and craft your testimony. So you've got 3 minutes. Remember, you've only got 3 minutes to weigh in here. And so, gather your thoughts. How would you describe where you live, the community of interest in which you are a part, to people that are not from your area? How would you describe that? What are the boundaries? Are there areas of common interest that you or your community have been impacted by legislation? For example, if you live in a city or a county with loads of folks, because we haven't expanded Medicare or Medicaid, for example, those costs roll downhill. So your tax bill locally is higher because the legislature has refused as a group to take billions of dollars that are actually our tax money. They've left it on the table. So there's a cost to these policies. And then what do you expect from this process? Do you expect them to primarily be concerned with their own political futures? Or are you concerned, or do you expect them to pay attention to the Voting Rights Act? Do you expect them to draw districts that allow the blessed community the same rights as everybody else? One person, one vote, right? So let's talk about how you build it. And just a point about why it should be you, because there's no one else coming. Only you know what's important in your community. Only you know what you want out of this process. If you leave it to lawyers and lobbyists and legislators, it's not as good as if you participate in building this record. And also, like, census data is amazing. I love the census. I'm a huge fan. However, that's really data. It's ones and zeros, right? So we have to put a face on that. We have to put a face on our experiences. And this is how you do it. So the first thing you got to do, thank the committee, tell them your name, and whether you represent yourself or a group, right? So it is A-okay if you say, my name is B. Moorhead, and I am here to testify on my own behalf today. But if you're part of an organization, if you're a volunteer, if you're a precinct chair, whatever it is, you can also tell them that. That is helpful knowledge. I know several folks that went through a training in Dallas that are all going to say they're, or they were talking about saying they're alum from a particular African-American fraternity. In part to keep track on who's actually, they have their own, this one group of folks had a contest. And so they would be able to catch in the record who actually weighed in based on how they introduced themselves. You don't want to spend a lot of time here, but they do ask you to make it clear. And sometimes when people don't think about it ahead of time, it sort of throws them off. And remember, you only have 3 minutes. So step 2. You want to describe your district, describe your community. And think about all of those examples we just went through. And I just gave you a couple here. These are just to get your creative juices flowing. I'm certainly not suggesting that you're all from Dallas and you live in the same neighborhood, right? And in fact, there's a date. The second example is dated. We know we have 2 new congressional seats. And let me just say, those 2 new seats, one needs to go in the northern suburbs of Dallas and one needs to go in the northwest suburbs of Houston. And that has everything to do with, because that's where there was a ton of growth. That's where there was a ton of growth. All right. So you've said who you are and you've described your community. Way to go. Next thing you want to do is, how is gerrymandering harmful to you? Right? You're trying to tell them why this is important to you. And for people that look like me, right? People that are Anglo, I do not want you to be afraid of or shy away from. No one has been more harmed by map manipulation and voter suppression than Black and Latino communities whose voices have been minimized in the ballot box and in Congress and the state legislature. It is okay to say that. In fact, you could live in the nicest neighborhood in the world, and you could, have all the exact wonderful representatives that you want. But this right here is very important because it happens to be true. And then, or you can give an example of an issue that you care about. For example, my mother submitted testimony, and she talked about the scarcity of groundwater in the Central Texas region and why gerrymandering and sort of a mishmash of federal, state, and local authorities couldn't sort of get a plan together. They weren't willing to work together. And certainly her congressman, who lives in Weatherford, Roger Williams, and she lives here. She'd never met him, never heard of him, and he'd never, had anything to do with her. And she felt like that was really important. Or you can go for the 30,000 foot. I worry about how divided we are as a country, and gerrymandering and map manipulation only make that problem worse. So gerrymandering not only helps people stay in power that are already in power, it also, it really enlivens sort of if politics is a bell curve and there's the far left and the far right, if your district is drawn so the only people you have to care about are primary voters, then that's what your leadership is going to be about, unless you're a very special member of the legislature. So gerrymandering makes the situation we're in infinitely worse. Finally, what do you want them to do about it? Right? You got to ask for something. You got to tell them what you want, direct them to act. They are your representatives, not the other way around. How about I ask that you not manipulate maps in support of one party or one politician? I want you to follow the law. I want competitive districts where possible. I want you to end this system of rewarding the powerful and the connected. All of this stuff, you will think of your own example, but the point here is that what do you want from this process? And this is where you say that. And I'm going to send you this worksheet so that you can sort of put together your thoughts with these writing prompts. And then I think you've got 3 minutes that you can really do something with. So I'm going to stop sharing because I think we're probably pretty close to time, and see if people have questions.
So first of all, thank you both Genevieve and Bonnie. The first question, and we've seen a couple iterations of this both in the chat and the Q&A, which we've kind of been answering as we went, but can you speak some to why testimony is important? Is it just to try to change minds of members of the committee, or what's the purpose of that testimony?
Given the sheer lack of interest on the part of the legislative committee chairman to have an open process where people are invited in an easy and simple way to participate now that maps have dropped, I seriously doubt you're going to change any hearts and minds. I think this is about building a solid public record so that when future courts look at what happened in Texas, that there are lots and lots of members of the public armed with their own stories, their own version of what Texas should be, for the litigators and the judges to look at. I don't think you're going to change Joan Huffman's mind.
All right. Bonnie, anything to add there, or she nailed it?
No, I absolutely agree. I think that the legislature is going to adopt maps that benefit the legislators in power. And all of the maps have been sued over. Every single time a legislature adopts a map, people who are unhappy with the map will sue. So what you're setting forth, whether you're supportive of the maps or you're not supportive of the maps, what you're creating is a record for the litigation that's about ready to ensue.
So speaking of looking at maps, I've never done this before, and I'm certainly not an expert, but I know the Senate map dropped, I guess, over the weekend, and I started looking at it. Do you have any advice for just normal folks who are listening or watching from throughout Texas about what to do with that map, and maybe where to find some analysis and help on figuring out what it means?
Yeah. Go ahead, Bonnie.
So I just sent you my presentation, Scott, and at the very last slide is resources. And one of those is the district viewer that the Texas legislature has, which all of the maps that are submitted by any legislator, whether they are a member of the redistricting committee or not, will be uploaded into that process. And you can overlay different maps on top of each other. So you can see what a map looks like as proposed, and then overlay what the current maps are so that you can kind of see what that would do to your district. You can also click on a specific district and it will give you all of the demographic information for that district. And so it makes it a very easy interactive kind of way for people to understand what those districts are and what they would look like.
All right, so I would recommend for those of you that are looking for a little deeper dive and are not afraid of free software, Dave's Redistricting. And I dropped the link in the chat. In fact, in Dave's, the map is already loaded. The Senate map 2101 is already loaded. And if you choose demographic and partisan theming, it'll give you a pretty good read of the many problems that are on this Senate map.
Perfect. Thank you. Question from the Q&A. Texas Impact represents people of faith. So could religious people be considered a community of interest here in Texas, specifically talking about in Northwest Austin, the Jewish Community Center, for example?
100%. In fact, I did a mini training with the RAC folks, the Reform folks, and I think a group of them went to testify, and it was a really interesting discussion because within that particular community, one of their objectives for the group was to work on social justice through the lens of particularly race. And so they were very interested in what they could do. And I honestly, when you say, you're representing yourself for a group, I think you can tell them exactly like what community you belong to. I think that's 100% fine. And what it shows, frankly, is a diversity of opinion, thought, and background.
I would also add, Scott, that for the map drawers inside the Texas legislature, those sort of things like where neighborhoods are, you can pull up school districts, but things like neighborhoods or religious areas where you have a Jewish community. That's not something that's preloaded into those map software. We can find race, we can find partisanship. We can't find things like that, which is why that kind of testimony is critical. Not only where is that community, but kind of what are the boundaries that we need to look for to be able to keep that community together, because we can't see that. And unless you live there, then you don't know.
And that's why the other reason why testimony is so important, right? Because like I said before, those ones and zeros are really cool. And you can learn so much about a place by census data, which you can never learn is what you can bring to it, what you know about your area. They simply will not know any other way. Again, I don't think they'll care, but I do think putting it in the record is important. And I'm seeing a couple of things on the chat. I am absolutely A-okay with setting up, frankly, for tomorrow or Thursday night, a session just on testimony, where we can talk about testimony and workshop testimony. And I'll work with Scott after this is over to see if y'all really want to do that. I'm happy to do it.
I am seeing several of you put your email addresses in the chat. If others don't want to send their email address to everybody, you can email me at scott@texasimpact.org and I'll put a list together. And we'll communicate that way. So thank you for that offer. We've mentioned testimony several times and just had a question about that, but is there a significant difference between written and in-person public testimony, or is it all just compiled into a record?
It's compiled into a record, although I would defer to Bonnie because she's actually been through it. I don't suspect that they read written testimony per se, but it does go in the public record.
I will say the last time we did redistricting, When we got down to the special session just for the congressional districts, when we had the hearing, our map drawer was in the office listening to the testimony and adjusting lines based on testimony. So I would say it does have an impact. Written testimony is great for litigation, but I will say written testimony is taken into account. It really is.
Okay. I'm getting all kinds of text messages right now. I probably shouldn't have just put myself out there like that. That was probably a mistake on my part. So for churches or communities of faith who have members all over a community and in multiple counties, is there anything that you would suggest that they be doing as part of this process right now?
Yeah, I mean, I still think you testify, and I still think you name the community that you're in, regardless of whether you're in an enclave or if you're in a larger community. Yeah.
All right. So I think we're close to wrapping up. Is there anything that you would leave listeners with tonight? Any last minute asks, anything that we forgot to ask you that you really want to make sure that you're getting out there?
Let's see. I dropped my email in the chat. You're more than welcome to reach out to me with questions. I will tell you that it's going to be a busy few days, so might be better to just put together a testimony workshop really for tomorrow night or the night after to see if we can't knock out a bunch of questions there. And then don't forget, so I mainly talked about the Senate hearings that are happening on Friday or Saturday. There are likely to be hearings on congressional maps next week, and perhaps towards the end of the week or the beginning of the following week, testimony on House maps as well. And I'm happy to send the talking points that we put together to the group, to B and Scott. And I know y'all are nonpartisan, so you take out the parts that you don't want in there and you send them out to the rest of the people.
Hey, Scott, can I throw in one thing real quick?
Absolutely.
So in all the questions about testimony, I just want to add one other reason that testimony is really important. And that is the public education factor. So the legislature broadcasts all of its public hearings. So if you provide testimony in person, it will create video of you providing that testimony that then Texas Impact and other organizations can use to help create public education information. That's also true if you write written testimony. So if you do submit written testimony, even if, as Genevieve says, it's unlikely that anyone is reading every word of everybody's written testimony, please do CC Texas Impact on it, because we would very much like to know that people have submitted, and we'd like to know what you've said.
I do have one probably relevant question. I'm not suggesting that the rest of y'all's aren't relevant. But somebody asked, how many people will typically testify on this? I know we have watched all-nighters on testimony, and I think I saw Josh testify at 6 a.m. one morning after a 9 a.m. hearing started. So if people are planning on doing public testimony, should they plan on like bringing a sleeping bag or?
You know, all of the hearings have up to now, we were so excited to get 10 people, right? I mean, the House process required, it should be a lawsuit all by itself, how hard it was to testify virtually in the House. But I suspect that these next couple of hearings, because there are so few opportunities to weigh in now that there are maps, that they're going to be busy, but they're not going to be like pro-choice, they make you testify at 4 a.m. busy.
All right. So with that, Genevieve kind of gave us some closing thoughts. Bonnie, anything to close us out with tonight?
I would just say this is going to be a long process. The legislature is going to adopt maps, and there's going to be litigation, and there's going to be news updates about a court is going to change or stop or implement a map, and it's going to possibly be very confusing. Try to find a resource like Texas Impact that provides you with that information on an ongoing basis that you trust, where you can find out how you can continue to keep educated and to continue to know when you can provide your comments throughout the entire process, because this is about your ability to vote and your ability to elect the person that you feel represents you. And I don't think there's anything more sacred in our Constitution than that.
Thank you. Thank you. B, anything to add before we close it out? All right. Well, I on behalf of everybody who was participating tonight and the Texas Impact staff, Bonnie, Genevieve, thank you so much for your time this evening. It really was a blessing for all of us as we try to figure out how we navigate these next few weeks, months, and frankly, years. I just want to say thank you. And thank you all for tuning in to be a part of this conversation. But let's remember that the work does not stop because we learned something tonight, right? That we spend this evening, we spend the next couple of days processing what we learned and actually taking action. Democracy is not a spectator sport. We have work to do. And if you've made it this far in the program, I do want to remind you that Texas Impact has opportunities for you to get involved. We have the rapid response team and legislative engagement groups that'll send you action alerts when you need to make telephone calls to your representatives or pair you up with other advocates in your legislative district to do this work in an ongoing way. Finally, if you appreciate the programming tonight, Texas Impact is a membership organization. We hope that you and your congregation are members. You can do that by going to texasimpact.org/join. Once again, thanks everybody. Thank you to everybody for being here tonight. Now let's get to work.